Welcome to Unit 3, and in this unit, you'll learn everything you need to know for cellular energetics.
Okay, NADPH and the ATP that we have created, okay, and remember these inputs come from the light reactions. And we're going to use that and carbon dioxide to ultimately make a carbohydrate building block. And this carbohydrate building block can be changed into glucose, okay, and it can be stored as a polymer called starch. Now, the Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, okay? So this open space, this fluid-filled space of the chloroplast. Now, what it does, it has a carbon fixing enzyme. So it takes the carbon dioxide and it basically builds a glucose molecule. Okay. And in order to do that, because carbon dioxide as a reactant has a much lower energy than glucose, so you can see that it requires energy. It is an endorganic process. So it needs that energy from somewhere, and it gets that energy from ATP. Okay. Now, in order also to build a molecule, we need electrons, and it gets those electrons from NADPH. And remember, NADPH got its electrons from water that was split. Yeah, so that is how the Calvin cycle ultimately makes a carbohydrate building block. Now, the guided question I want you to keep in mind today as we go through this lesson is you need to ask yourself, how is this carbon dioxide, how is it incorporated into organic molecules? So we've already learned about the inputs of the Calvin cycle, which is carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH. And remember, this comes from the light reactions, okay? ATP and NADPH, they come from the light reactions. Carbon dioxide is fixated into the Calvin cycle with a carbon fixing enzyme. Okay, so there is an enzyme that takes this carbon dioxide and it adds it to the Calvin cycle. We will have reduction in the Calvin cycle and then also regeneration of the starting molecule. Now, what is returned to the light reactions is ADP and the inorganic phosphate that will go to ATP synthase, and NADP plus will go and get more electrons to be reduced again. Now, the location of the Calvin cycle is in the stroma of the chloroplast. So why ATP and NADPH are required? ATP, okay, it provides the energy for the carbon fixation pathway because it is an endorganic pathway, meaning that my reactants are at a lower energy level than my products. So it needs energy. And therefore, if I hydrolyze ATP, okay, I can make this reaction favorable by adding, so this is the reactant, and if I add a phosphate group to that reactant, it moves into a higher energy level, and then that reaction then becomes favorable, and it will happen. So ATP is needed to drive this inorganic process. And NADPH, that is required to reduce carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. Okay, so we need to form these carbon-hydrogen bonds because in these chemical bonds, this is where we store energy. Okay, and that is why we need the reducing powers, because without that reducing powers, it's unable to make carbohydrates because we need to be able to make those chemical bonds. Okay. The Calvin cycle that happens in the stroma of the chloroplast. So here I can see that 3 carbon dioxides are entering this Calvin cycle. This means this Calvin cycle has been repeated 3 times, and it needs to repeat itself 3 times to have one G3P molecule leave. Okay, so remember it starts out with the starting molecule. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and then with carbon fixation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's make this carbon molecule red. So carbon fixation is we add that in. But now I have that times, I have 6 molecules. So it's this times 3. Okay, this is all the energy that I need to process this endergonic process because the reactant, the products constantly have more energy than the reactants. And I also need the reducing power to store the chemical energy in the chemical bonds. Now, after 3 turns, I am able to make one G3P molecule. Okay, I'm adding all 3 carbon dioxides in here, for example. It's not necessarily that all 3 carbon dioxides join. Maybe one of these carbon dioxides is now part of the regeneration. Okay, because most of the carbon stays in the cycle. Okay, and that is why this cycle can continue and continue and continue. But overall, this cycle needs to turn 6 times to ultimately make one glucose molecule. And you can even see that in the formula for photosynthesis. Okay, we have 6 carbon dioxides to make one glucose that has 6 carbons in it. So that is why the cycle needs to turn 6 times to make one glucose. If you like that lesson, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.